Welcome to the Future of Sharing, this series where we're trying to figure out how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone. This is done in partnership with Airbnb. I'm Pete Light, I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company that's driving the conversation. And today we've got Orville Schell, who is essentially the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S China Relations for the Asia Society, and it is fantastic to have you here. He also is the author of no less than 15 books, 10 of which are on China, and his last one, Wealth in Power, was a fantastic big picture orientation to really get in what China is today, which we're going to update a little bit here. Thanks for coming in.
Pleasure.
And talking. Well, you just said you've just returned from a trip to China with President Trump, and that's an interesting kind of. But do you want to just put the context of what were you doing there, and how did it? Just give us some background on that whole trip and why you got there.
Well, with this new president enthroned, and with him having during the campaign spoken so much about China, and indeed done so in rather antagonistic terms, in terms of trade and South China Sea, their failure to do what he thinks they ought to have done in regard to nuclearization of North Korea, etc. I thought that him going on this incredible hegira, which took him to Hawaii, then to Tokyo, then to Seoul, then to Beijing, then to Da Nang, Hanoi, Philippines, and home. I mean, no president has taken a trip like this for, I think, ever. That this would be worth checking in on. Not only is he a kind of an uncertainty principle in his own right, but watching him sort of ricochet around the Confucian world and end up in the Philippines, where his sort of body double, Rodrigo Duterte, is in power. All of this was too irresistible.
But did you go as a press corps?
I went for Vanity Fair to write a piece on Trump and what the fate of U.S. China relations is going to be under this new administration.
Well, can you give us a little sense? Just, I mean, because this is a good place to start. Is the big picture, China, U.S., where this is going, as we drive down a little bit more into the economy and how it's working on the ground in China. But what is your kind of top of mind thinking about this?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the world, there are really only two countries of sort of ignorable consequence: the U.S. and China.
In terms of everything, or in terms of climate?
In terms of everything.
Okay.
I mean, these are the two big dogs on the block. So there are almost no global questions which will be easily resolved without them somehow interacting. And yet, we have very antagonistic values and political systems. And so when Trump came into office, speaking about China as the enemy, raping America's trade, sort of desecrating American, hollowing out American industries, and and currency exchange, said he'd declare them a manipulator on his first day, which he did not do. This sort of raised a real flag that if the U.S. and China are going to be in such an antagonistic state, how are we going to solve questions like climate change, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, much less conduct orderly global trade? So it was with that in mind that I thought, this trip would be worth going on to see what he was going to do. Because after all, remember, when he was running, he started, really dressing down our allies, both in Europe and in Asia, Korea, Japan, for not bearing their fair share of the defense burden of the alliance. And, he was taking some very extreme positions. So the question of what he would do when he actually got there, how would the fabric of what had been a kind of a reasonably sedate alliance system around the world, how would that sort of ultimately be recomposed? So that's why I went.
I mean, if you had it coming back here, you're on the ground, how did it go? Did it surprise you? Or what's your takeaway on that level?
Well, I mean, the first thing was that it was almost as if he were on some computer dating schedule. I mean, from one big leader to another, and I think that is actually a reasonably telling metaphor, because in a certain sense, for Donald Trump, what is important is not U.S. national interest, not policy, but how is he doing mano a mano to the leader. In other words, does he have a good relationship? Is he winning them? It's a bit of like a beauty contest, like you know what was this show, The Apprentice.
Yeah.
You know, can you win the other person? So as he went from country to country, there was very much of that in play. This was the Donald Trump show. This wasn't a big ideological discussion. This wasn't a question of the details of trade. It was a kind of an interaction between him and these leaders as he went around Asia to see if he could sort of beguile them. It was courtship.
And was it relatively successful? He came back blowing about it, although other people were pulling their hair out.
You know, you never know with Donald Trump whether the thing that was self-evident was that America, even in its fallen state of grace, is still of consequence. So when Air Force One touches down in Japan or Korea or Vietnam or China, they still turn out and they still roll out the red carpets and they still do the whole 9 yards of ceremony. And of course, this is very appealing to Trump. He loves to be sort of pandered to. And so one watched very carefully to see how these interactions went along. How much of it is real? How impressed were they? Was there real friendship? I mean, it's very hard to say. I have a hard time believing any of these people were taken in by this guy, and yet he did seem to establish a pretty good relationship with Shinzo Abe. They played golf, they had meals. Shinzo Abe gave him a nice hat saying, making the U.S.-Japan alliance great again. And, you know, Trump said there was great chemistry, you know, great friendship, never had two leaders so friendly. I mean, all of this sort of over-the-top description of the personal relationship. So this is what he does.
Yeah.
Now, it's worth something, but it certainly doesn't get to the heart of the matter, which is those things which are dividing us, or much less a kind of an assay of where we agree or where we should go. It's all very theatrical. This former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, a friend, Danny Russell, calls it diplotainment, which I think is an apt description.
That's what it is from. So let's take it to China, which is your area of incredibly deep expertise. So, and we don't have to worry so much about what Trump thought about it. But what do the Chinese make of him, and how do they actually think of America right now, given all these kind of, not just the Trump, but the whole paralysis in our politics, the kind of state of American politics and our leadership now? Where are they coming from when you kind of see them through the prism of this visit with Trump? It's probably come to a head in some way.
Well, you know, they were, the Chinese Communist Party, being a good Leninist party that does not believe in sort of Enlightenment, humanistic values, much less democratic principles, always was very sort of neuralgic about people like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, because they were people of sort of good principle. You know, freedom, liberty, rights, all of these, the verities that sort of came out of the French Revolution. So they contemplated Donald Trump's arrival with some interest, thinking that maybe, you know, sort of thug to thug, you can work something out. You divide up the territory, it's sort of capo to capo, you know. On the other hand, they were very wary by this guy because he was manifestly so unpredictable. And moreover, he came into office and he won the presidency by the most strident kinds of attacks against China. And some of them justified and some of them quite unfair. and his whole notion of them as a currency manipulator is certainly true in the past, but less true now. But anyway, that sort of threw them off balance. So they, like everybody, were in uncharted territories. However, I think they played it pretty well. They didn't start reacting in a kind of an extreme point-to-point manner. They just kept cool. They kept, what they do very well is just be opaque, just non-responsive. And then, and there's a very interesting story how all this happened. Of course, Xi Jinping, who's not only, he's Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, but they've added on a kind of a throwaway title of president so that he can, in polite company, doesn't have to be a head of a communist party. He can be addressed as president. So then he came to Mar-a-Lago. You remember that. And that was a kind of a very strange.
Were you there for that?
I wasn't there for that. I would have liked to be. I would like to be at Mar-a-Lago. I wouldn't like it, but I would have, as a journalist, I would have found it rich pastures to browse in. So they established a kind of a, quote, good personal relationship. I mean, again, what does that mean? Is it a simulacrum of a good personal relationship? That's good enough for these guys, you know? Yeah. And so then when Trump went off again on this trip, they at least had a basis of kind of some sort of manifest friendship rather than antagonism. And in a certain sense, Trump is kind of the man of the hour, I think, now for the Chinese, because he doesn't raise a lot of vexing, disturbing questions about democracy and human rights and principles that, you know, never mind. Let's just see if we like each other and work out a deal on North Korea and trade. So that's kind of transactional, and the Chinese feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, that's their thing. Well, so, okay, stepping back from the Trump piece of this, I've checked in with you over the years on your kind of analysis of the two superpowers at some level. Where are we in that relationship right now? I mean, in your own just kind of Orville analysis of things, what's the moment we're in with these two colossus things? I'm curious on your quick hit on that kind of, the big picture context a little bit of both economically and politically, what's going on right now?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that if you, look at the question of wealth and power, you would have to say China is a lot wealthier and a lot more powerful in the last 3, 4, 5 years. It's been quite a remarkable progress that they've made. You have to remember this was once the sick man of Asia, and then they had a Maoist revolution, which really sort of stopped them in their tracks for a couple of decades. And then suddenly they got hit with the 1989 demonstrations against the party and the Beijing massacre, and most people thought that would be the end, but it wasn't. And the party managed to come back. And quite counterintuitively, and against, I think, most people's expectations, whereas they began to open up both economically and politically in the 80s and the 90s, under the present leader, Xi Jinping, they have continued to make economic progress, but they have really clamped down politically. So they have begun to perfect what looks to be a very different kind of a model from the one we thought China would slowly evolve into. You know, that open markets would lead to open societies, and slowly they would evolve and become more convergent with the values, the system of global trading system, the treaty system, the whole, global system that we were kind of the keystone in the arch. But that's not happened. And in effect, what has happened is the U.S., I think the returns are not totally in, but we do seem to be in a state of some decline, some uncertainty about our own ability to renew ourselves, to refurbish ourselves, and to make democracy effective. On the other hand, China is doing reasonably well, albeit not without certain tensions and problems, to be sure. And so they have been tempted, I think, to view themselves now, more than ever. Before, they were sort of just experimenting on the way someplace and they weren't sure where. Now I think they're beginning to say, well, maybe we're there. Maybe our system has its merits, has its virtues, and should be proclaimed. And they just had the 19th Party Congress a month ago, and that was one of the outcomes, in effect, to crow a little loudly about this new era of Chinese development with Chinese characteristics, they call it. So this is sort of where we are. Now the U.S. has got to kind of figure out, what are we going to do about trade? It's not a level playing field. I think in many ways the U.S. has been shut out. It has been unfair. What do we do about the South China Sea? I mean, they've just declared this vast area that hangs down from South China all the way to Indonesia. They basically said, it's ours. And the 7th Fleet is out there patrolling around, so what should the U.S. do? Nobody really has any idea what the proper response is. Japan and China are feuding over some islands. North Korea's got nuclear weapons and ICBMs. How do we deal with this? And how do you deal with it without China? So these were all of the kinds of derangements that confront Trump, and that made his trip particularly interesting, because he had to, in some sense, do something about some of them.
Although it's kind of over his head at some level, don't you think? I mean, at some level, or
well, it's hard to know, what's going to happen with North Korea. That's a very, very troublesome problem, because it's a very unstable Stalinist regime, and even China doesn't like it. But China's very wary about teaming up with the U.S. in anything that has a smack of regime change, because they know in their heart of hearts we don't particularly like their regime, and they worry about what would be fair for the goose would be fair for the gander. So there's a great reluctance to disturb that satrapy, even though it's a very retrograde, dangerous one. But they have cooperated much more with sanctions in the UN, and so Trump is trying to push them to see if he can't get them to exercise maximum pressure on North Korea. Will that turn the trick? I don't know.
But again, thinking more structurally or big picture point of view, are you, because I know you've had different thoughts of this over the years, are you thinking that this Chinese system of their kind of version of capitalism, but also their version of kind of command and control politics, do you think it's got more of a future than at one point? I would generally have said you were more in the category of thinking with time they're going to have to do something about democratizing it, et cetera. Maybe that's limited, but that's roughly the general trajectory that a lot of people had. But do you think now they have maybe figured out a 21st century model that, in contrast to the paralysis of Western liberalism, is potentially a better way forward, given climate change and all the stuff we got?
I think this is the great question that now confronts the world, and why sort of the global order is so off balance. I think it would be fair to say that most people didn't believe that China would get this far with a one-party system and the sort of retrograde Leninist structure, but it has. Now, does that mean it's viable in the long term? I mean, I'm surprised that they've done as well as they've done, I have to say. But I also think that, Pete, you know well from being in California that just as soon as you think there's a new economy and new terms of the game, and people start proclaiming it, that the old verities reassert themselves. And I think in ways which we cannot see, China has instabilities built into it. It's one of the least resolved systems, whether it's economics or politics or whatever it is. And it isn't really a very relaxed, well-integrated sort of final model. And you could say democracy hasn't worked well, but countries go for hundreds of years without having major upheavals, And I'm not sure that China's present system will afford it that luxury for, for another 10, 20, 30 years. The history of one-party systems is not suggested durability.
Really, in the long historical
In the
realm.
long historical realm.
So if you had to just kind of without, we could spend 5 hours in this conversation, but if you had to touch on the big disruptors of that, I could guess at a few of them, but what do you see as the things that to you in the next 10 years are just going to break the system open in a way that people aren't predicting it?
The disruptors that we had sort of thought would be intruding into it were things like the internet and private enterprise, entrepreneurs, who once they get loose and free, they want to have more political power, more. But the party's been very artful in how both have been controlled. I think no one imagined that the party could bring the internet to heel as successfully as China has. Not completely, but so most people don't get contaminated by things that they're not supposed to see or read or hear. We find quite counterintuitively that businesses, some of these huge big businesses, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, which are essentially private corporations operating in this sort of strange hybrid economy of state-owned enterprises existing alongside of private enterprises. Now the party is requiring them to have party branches within their midst. And the party is now starting to require that they sell a certain amount of stock to the state so that they have representation. So in other words, we thought the tendency would be for private enterprise to become more private, more sort of integrated into the world, the global community, the global value system, and that China would slowly give up its state-owned enterprises, the state sector. But they haven't. It's now going in exactly the opposite direction.
But it seems to be quite successful from that point of view.
Yes, I think it's still it does surprise one with how it's endured, and the degree to which another great conceit was that innovation couldn't really thrive under a system like this. And I think we have to acknowledge in retrospect that maybe certain kinds of innovation can't. Maybe the very high ends, particularly maybe in the arts and politics and maybe theoretical physics or something, it's hard to say. But actually a lot of innovation does take place in sort of the middle reaches of this food chain, in how to do the sharing economy, how to do business administration, how to rewire things, how to innovate in terms of marketing, things like that. They've been pretty good at.
So are you saying that those two pieces, the internet and entrepreneurial kind of free market, could come back to still kind of disrupt the system? Or are you thinking those are kind of set aside, that didn't work? Do you see other things potentially disrupting the system? I'm just curious on what gives you pause before you think that this system is set and it's going to be set up for the next kind of 50-year run here that other post-war systems got set up for 50 years, that kind of I'm just curious about what are the issues that you see under the surface that might actually be candidates for that kind of disruption?
Well, I think those of us who have followed China for a long time have been quite surprised by the fact that there hasn't been more sort of ferment pushing from below. There is in some ways, and you don't hear about it. They don't report it in the media, striking workers who have no jobs or environmentally concerned people. But I'm surprised at the degree to which they've managed through extensive surveillance and controls to control these things, to put the private world of private enterprises back again under party control to a greater extent than before, and to bring things like the media, the internet, any sort of potentially game-changing, disrupting forces, to sort of defang them. It's been quite impressive. Now, where are the rubs? I think the biggest rub is that every economy has cycles. And if you have a system that is so dependent for legitimacy on economic growth rates remaining high, you know, at some point you're gonna hit a wall. It's just the nature of things. Never mind the kind of system. And then, of course, the global economy has ups and downs, of which China is now deeply embedded and deeply dependent. So it isn't within their hands in a way to control their economic destiny. So that is a disruptor. That, I think, is the disruptor of all disruptors and potentially the most dangerous.
Have you been surprised to the extent of that they've been able to control Western technology companies, Western media from being really any kind of real serious presence there? I mean, to what extent has that surprised you, the kind of Western lack of influence in that country? Because again, this does kind of get into the future of the sharing economy and things, which is the platform economy. It feels like they've been able to contain that kind of disruption. Is that your opinion too?
I think we did blithely assume that slowly, as China became wealthier and more successful and more comfortable in its skin, they would allow Western media and they'd allow greater penetration of Western companies, less protectionism. I mean, there are whole areas of the Chinese economy that are off bounds for Chinese investment, like telecom. You know,
for Western
investment. Yeah, Western or banks that just opening up a little, and you know, defense, many others, media. There's no Western media. They have central global Chinese television, radio, Beijing International, China Daily, all in this country. We have nothing there, and they won't allow it. So I think one is surprised by the degree to which they've been able to do it this way with a complete lack of reciprocity. They have, what, 75 Confucius Institutes in America. There's not a single institute in the name of, let's say, Thomas Jefferson in China that they won't allow it. So there's a tremendous lack of reciprocity here. And it's been quite astonishing that I think America and the West has countenanced that. And the question is, should it? And is it sustainable? It basically isn't, at least in the economic realm. And American and Western businesses are tremendously disadvantaged on this unlevel playing field. And when technology transfer, when they go there, there's the terms of the game are forced technology transfer, or we won't let you in and you won't have a market. And businesses are so desperate to go because of the scale of the market, they kind of agree to anything, but they're unhappy.
Well, also, I mean, actually, it kind of comes down to some of these stats that are just crazy. I mean, it's also getting to the point where these are the top 10 companies in the world right now. All top 5 are all tech companies, West Coast space, 3 in Silicon Valley, 2 in Seattle. They're the ones we know: Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. But the next 2, I mean, right below them are Alibaba and Tencent. I mean, so now, is there a moment here where the Chinese economy has to go more global, and by going more global, it's got to shift something, or is there a next level of internal pressures that are going to shift the game a little bit here, both directions? Like, we have all these most powerful companies in the world, you know, all over the world now, and now not in China, but on the other hand, these Chinese companies are getting to the point where they got to start going beyond China. I mean, I'm just curious if you see the moment is any shifting going on, particularly around these tech companies breaking it out in a new way.
There was, up until about a year ago, a policy called the going out policy for China, which was recognizing precisely this, that the party wanted companies to expand abroad. They wanted to get the recognition, they wanted to have name brand conglomerates, and now they have a few. And they also wanted China to enter the global economy, not just be a domestic players. But there started to be such a rush of capital out of China. And partially, it was not just because there were good deals. There was some of that, of course. But also people were nervous about China. They recognized the sort of the unstable aspects of this whole proposition.
The Chinese people themselves?
Yeah. I remember a year and a half ago when it was less than that, when the Chinese stock market went over the edge. And the party had to pump money in and buy stocks, prevent people from selling and force people to buy. There was a joke that it was illegal to sell and illegal not to buy. So they would manipulate companies into manipulating the stock market. So that gave them a big fright. Anyway, there were many reasons, but hundreds of billions of dollars began to go abroad. And they had this great hemorrhage of a foreign exchange. And so, I'm not an economist, but I could see what was happening. Then the party figured out they really couldn't afford to have this money that was going abroad, because all these big guys who have these companies thought, well, let's get an anchor to windward in America, in Europe, who knows what will happen in China. And they were, in a certain sense, exporting a lot of capital, buying a lot of real estate, parking a lot of money overseas just in case. As Chinese women, if they're of means, will go abroad to have their child in Los Angeles so they can be American citizens. Or they'll buy a house. Or they'll endow a chair at Harvard or Hotchkiss or someplace so their kids can come to school here. There's a sense in China, despite the immense success, of a kind of a uncertainty, a provisional nature of this boom, which is, just sort of come out of nowhere, out of world history.
Which it sounds like it's a warranted. It's coming from your point of view, is like it's a warranted fear.
Well, you certainly want to keep an eye cocked to the instabilities in this admittedly incredibly successful system.
Okay, well let's. This is fascinating, and again, we could go so deep, and given all the strands of China and your expertise in this, let's focus a little bit on this sharing economy, which again, even. We've been studying this all over the world, the U.S. here and Europe and all the different pieces of where it's at. South Korea does a lot. But China, the numbers are just kind of crazy numbers on this. And, literally, I can just, they've literally claim, and again, this is something that actually, maybe you know something, when the government makes these numbers, claims these numbers, are they good enough to go with? Or are you always kind of a little bit?
It depends. Maybe growth rates, they always meet their growth rate.
Yeah. But this is, for example, literally there's 600 million Chinese were involved in the sharing economies last year, up from 500 million the year before. Or they're saying things like, and again, I'm not necessarily casting doubt on this, I'm just saying, but those numbers are just mind-boggling in terms of numbers of folks involved. They're talking about how basically China's sharing economy last year, 2016, was valued at approximately about $525 billion, up, doubling from 2015. They've got basically 5.8 million people, jobs were created in the sharing economy platforms. These are numbers that, compared to the West, are actually quite astounding. Any thoughts on that? Just on the numbers level, things to scale. I guess China's big.
China's big, 1.3 billion people. If you cut these numbers in half, they're still impressive.
Yeah, no, totally right.
So,
which is kind of where maybe there's a context, and again, you've done so many interesting, in fact, your last book was fascinating to me, going back into the 19th century and kind of the modernization of China. But sharing, is there something that resonates differently there about sharing? Because the basic sharing economy module is how do you make more of underutilized assets? The best face on it is how do you do more with empty rooms? How do you do more with cars sitting in a driveway? How do you do more with pieces of things that does everyone need a lawnmower kind of thing? That's the general intellectual way of approaching it, and actually there's a positive way to think about that from a sustainability point of view, from all kinds of things. It's an interesting mindset, and yet it's really biting there differently. And I'm just curious, is there a piece of this that's supercharging that in a way that we're maybe underestimating from the Western point of view? Like, wow, we're missing the point of the centrality of sharing, or any cultural pieces of that or historical pieces about that might give some insights?
Yeah, I mean, I think the paradox of the sharing economy in China is that under Mao, of course, China was the ultimate sharing economy. Everybody was in a commune. Nobody had a private house. Nobody had a private kitchen. You ate in a canteen. You know, you didn't own even your tools. You didn't own land. You owned nothing. Everything was collectivized. And it turned into an incredible disaster. And then they had to redivide the land up, repartition it out again to all the peasants, and they bought their own tools. They still don't own it, interestingly enough.
They don't own the land or the tools?
They lease it. They can get long-term lease backs. There's no private property in China. All the property these giant buildings are sitting on is owned by the state. And there's an actual big issue now that has arisen because the original leases on private property are going to soon come up for renewal. And people are saying, well, what do I own? Do I have to buy it over again? You know, they sort of bought an apartment or bought a building and they thought it was theirs, but it isn't because they don't own the property. So it's an incredible problem that they're going to confront. Anyway, the other cultural consideration, well, so to finish that thought, let's just say that the Chinese had their fill of collective life. And when Mao died and Deng came along, they got rid of the communes. They got rid of it, and everybody ran off and started being private entrepreneurs and working, selling stuff in the street and farming their own little patch. And that had its problems too, because that's where the whole revolution began. You couldn't do large-scale agriculture. Everything was too sort of atomized. But the cultural part that's sort of interesting in the sharing economy is that, you know, China always has emphasized family, clan, rather than simply individual, the individual. So that there is a sort of notion of sharing living space, sharing things, extended family. I mean, there's an expression of, you know, 四世同堂, of 3 generations under one roof. This was an ideal. That everybody
It goes way back.
It goes way back. That you would live together with your grandparents and your great-grandparents in different courtyards, and the kids would grow up in that environment. And actually, it's a wonderful kind of a social unit to raise kids in. So there were sort of these different things at work, but that tradition was destroyed by the revolution, which believed that was feudal, old-fashioned, and needed to be erased. So now we enter this new world of sort of hyper-individuality, which didn't extend into politics because it wasn't one man, one vote, or any vote. And now we get the sharing economy thrusting its way back into China, and it does have a logic. Because, I mean, for instance, there's a huge housing bubble in China. And I don't think the sharing economy has gotten here yet. Airbnb should have a special service for the millions of apartments that people have bought because they have money and they don't know where to invest it. And property's the best place to put it, but they're not using them. And it's a real problem because, you know, if you don't trust the stock market, and banks pay nothing, what are you going to do with your money? You buy property. So, I mean, there are ways in which some of the bubbles and some of the discontinuities can be evened out by the sharing economy. On the other hand, you go to China, I was there 10 days ago, you walk down streets and they're like piles of bicycles as big as a house. Sometimes they're not even slotted into racks, they're just thrown on a giant heap in a big tangle. And these are all, you know, like city bikes.
Sharing economy bikes.
Sharing economy. So every company, I don't know how many there are, it's unbelievable, flooding the streets with these things. You can't even walk down some sidewalks. They're just strewn everywhere. And each company's trying to crowd out the other company, overwhelm the other company. It's a little bit the same extremism I saw in the Cultural Revolution. the same extremism I saw when China started opening up, that when China does something, they just go at it hammer and tongs in the most excessive way.
Exactly. Well, the other thing about the sharing economy in China, from my understanding, is a lot of the sharing economy in the West, or in other countries, including South Korea and stuff, is about individuals owning a thing that they want to get more out of.
Right.
And by, hey, I'm going to drive as an Uber guy, or I'm going to, hey, rent out that room to get a little more info and stuff. But it seems like the sharing economy in China, including those bikes, they're not owned by anybody except the actual company. So they're not really in the same concept of a platform organizing individually owned pieces that get shared by people. It's actually a company owns a shitload of these bikes, and it just gets people
pour them in.
But people are sharing those bikes, to be sure. They're not literally having to have their own bikes. So it's a kind of weird evolution, or not evolution, distortion of what the classic sharing economy was.
The thing about China in general is that it's developed so rapidly, and it's a model that has no precedent, so that it's just replete with distortions.
Interesting.
And to the degree that the shared economy might straighten some of these out, that's probably good. I mean, in the shared ride sharing, for instance, they have developed a very, I mean, not only do they have, I mean, they chased out Uber, but like Didi Kuaishou, these ride sharing companies are very successful. And now the taxi cabs have gotten into ride sharing in a way which is much more successful than in New York or San Francisco, which is very backward.
That's interesting.
And the problem now is the taxis have gotten into being ride shared, and you can't flag one down in the street. They won't stop.
Because they're just going.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing about the sharing economy, again, comes out in other contexts, is many of the people who are involved in it are doing it for at least a part of their motivation is the sustainability side of things. It's like, really, why don't I share this rather than, or I don't need my own car, I can use this car sharing or ride sharing or all the various versions of it or what have you. When you've got 1.3 billion people in China, I mean, is part of what's driving this, do you think, some actual logic that you just, to organize a country with that many people, we're going to have to start sharing more? I mean, is there any kind of, is that a dimension of this, or is this just kind of a byproduct of it? You know what I'm saying? Is that driving what's going on?
Well, let's look at the main areas of sharing. I mean, there's bikes, there's cars, there's rooms. What else?
Well, they're actually, I mean, in there they're sharing basketballs and umbrellas, and they're sharing. I mean, those aren't working that well. Yeah. But there's, but essentially it's durable things that instead of. I mean, the positive side of it is like, does everyone in an American household need a power saw? Yeah. Does everybody need a lawnmower? Does everybody need, you know, the baby thing? Does everyone need the swing set? You know, we can kind of see the logic in the Western context. I'm just wondering, is there a comparable, even more enhanced reason for that in China, given that there's just so much space and so many people, and how the hell are you going to deal with it?
I think there is, but then you get down to the question of trust.
This is exactly another piece of the
because trust is really important in the sharing. If you're going to let people into your house,
right?
And then there's a huge division in China, for instance, just in the Airbnb world, that people don't have a lot of extra space, or they're so rich they don't care. So
they don't need to make any extra money.
They don't need to make any, and they have 10 apartments sitting empty, and they don't want the hassle of having to let people in, and they're not trying to make money. And the people who could use the money, by and large, it's they're living in some old apartment, and maybe they have some tiny little room, and the person they would have to let it out to who would be some pedicurist or something from the provinces, and maybe they don't want to do that. So I think, I'm not really familiar with the experience of Airbnb. I've never done it in China, but it'd be very interesting to see what the cultural differences are, and the differences in terms of who in the social sort of mobility chain has an incentive to do it.
Well, we've looked at some of these numbers. For example, it's definitely younger. It's completely millennials.
Yes.
Almost across the board.
But how many of those have apartments?
Well, this is although I must say my daughter, a Westerner, was traveling in China and actually spent a couple different times for full months Airbnb stays in this context as a room with a Chinese host, some women there. She absolutely loved the damn thing because she got to know the Chinese host. The host took them into the neighborhoods. I mean, there was this whole cultural experience thing, which was fascinating.
Was it
And
big
it also
cities
helped.
or
They were
countries?
big cities. It was Guangzhou and Beijing and stuff like that. So, and these people could speak English, and so I don't know how that filter worked, but anyhow, I don't want to digress it. But there is a younger scene over there that does work both ways. They want to connect with the Westerners, and they also.
But you know, there's another sort of affectation to be considered here. In China, you stay in a hotel. The minute you check in, your name goes to the Public Security Bureau automatically. If you stay at home and you have an apartment, but you're a foreigner, you have to, within 24 hours, register with the Public Security Bureau. So this is this incredible surveillance state. Now, Airbnb, you see, has the potential to kind of throw all that into a cocked hat. How are they going to keep track of people?
That's interesting.
So you're going to have a lot of foreigners running around renting rooms, and they're not going to know where they are. And this is not the way things work in China. So there are questions like that that arise when you have people sort of doing things down at the lower levels. I mean, Chinese have always known where people are. Way back in the day, they had a thing called a baojia system. Now they have the hukou, the household registration card. Everybody has one, and everybody can be followed through that. And it entitles you to live in some places and not in others.
Do you know much about this social credit kind of thing? Can you explain that a little bit? Because there's the new thinking is that there's some. Well, you explain it, because
so this is a new system which I think the Chinese are best equipped in the world to affect, because they're now issuing identity cards to everybody, and so they can keep track of it. Yeah. But what they're sort of proposing to do is to create, through these big internet companies, data banks that would pool. You buy a ticket to go someplace, you shop in a mall, you appear in a newspaper. Whatever you do, it all will go into your sort of data place. Now, presently, those people who they want to watch, and there are a lot of them, everybody traditionally had what they called a dangan, a file. The party maintained the file, and it went with you wherever you went. You never got to see it. And your job record, your marital record, your divorces, your fights with your kids, whatever, if you said something, got in trouble, got put in jail for being a rightist, a counter-revolution, whatever, all went into your files. This new social credit is a very ginned up, very sophisticated way to collect a lot more information about everybody, and everybody will have an electronic file that will all have fingerprints, iris prints, have all kinds of information about your life will all be in there, and you won't have access to it.
And it's something like a credit score where it would prevent you from doing certain things?
Well, that would be the more modest ambition of it, because people do have credit agencies, and they certainly keep track of your credit. But they also would be able to keep track of everything else you do.
What does that mean? So if you were talking bad about the party or something, that would affect your ability to get a mortgage or something?
Yeah, or you go to university, all your records, what courses did you take, what papers did you write, did you join this group, did you join that group? Those groups may become subversive later on. So in other words, it is a way to collect harmless information, economic information, consumer information, and all other kinds of information on everybody, and very efficiently store it.
And this is happening, or is it a plan, or they're just starting to do it?
There is a plan, and they're now beginning to sort of centralize all of the different data feeds through all of the big companies like Baidu, Tencent, and whatnot. They'll even have your record from Taobao, from Alibaba. What did you buy? What did you order?
So what is that, again, looking at the big picture, what does that say to you? Is that...
What it says to me is there's not a highly evolved appreciation of the right to privacy.
For sure, but do you feel like that's the kind of thing that would drive people? I mean, well, actually, it kind of circles back to this thing of trust.
Yeah.
Because because I do want to kind of end our interview talking about the trust, because trust is so central to the social sharing economy. But if you have a situation where everything you do could be seen by the state, and that will affect what you can do in your life, what does that do to trust? I mean,
this is Orwell to the 10th power.
Yeah.
And it means you either trust the party and become a creature of the party, or you're going to be a very unhappy person. There's going to be no way to dodge it. There's going to be, in the old days in China, when you ran into trouble or a dynasty fell, you could become a Buddhist monk, go up in the mountains, become a Taoist hermit, and escape, or become a scholar and disappear into the countryside and just read your classics and write your poetries and do your painting. No more. There's no escape. That's what this social credit thing says. And when you see the levels of sophisticated surveillance that the Chinese have put in, the cameras at every street corner, every angle, this is one of the most tightly surveilled, and now it will be one of the most tightly organized data collection systems on individuals in the world.
But is that the spark? I mean, at some point that's so stifling to, I mean, I know up till now the entrepreneurial kind of business class or the internet folks have kind of gone with the program, but at some point when it gets to that level of suffocating control and observation, is that the thing that pushes people over the edge?
Well, the thing is that it doesn't reach the boiling point until you want to do something they don't want you to do. And then it may be too late. If you're really smart, that may be one reason why there was a lot of capital flight. People wanted to, as I say, anchor themselves to windward in case something happened. I do think it gets back to your fundamental appraisal of what is human nature. I mean, do human beings fundamentally feel happier and more comfortable and have better lives if they have a higher quotient of freedom? Or if they can go to the mall and shop and watch, party-sponsored TV programs about fighting the Japanese in World War II, is that the good life? And not be starving?
Well, I mean, not that anyone can sum up a people, but you've been over there as much as any Westerner. What do you think about that? Where do they fall on that? I mean, how long can this last at that level?
I think we're in a totally brave new world here. We're in an experiment the likes of which we've never seen before in human history. And really what's being tested is exactly this question about what it means to be human, what human beings want and need, and trust is one element within that. But Leninist systems have never been known for placing much faith in trust. They place faith in pressure, punishment, discipline, order, hierarchy, authority, orthodoxy. So trust is a very quaint notion. They talk about it all the time, but it doesn't mean the same thing it would to you.
What does it mean to them in a way that you mean?
They talk about we don't have a high level of mutual trust with the United States. What they mean is, why doesn't the United States accept us? Why do you keep doubting us? Why do you keep thinking we're on the wrong side of history? As Clinton famously said to Jiang Zemin in 1998. It means, be obedient and there's no problem. The classic statement when you get in trouble in China, you say, would you please explain what is wrong, what the affront is? And they'll say, well, you know what you did wrong. what it is, in effect, is throwing it back on you to sort of incriminate yourself, to blame yourself for your whatever infraction. And that isn't exactly trust. This is a kind of a game they play. But
so that's the trust between the state or the authorities. But what about horizontal trust? I mean, do the Chinese people, when you really get in the fabric of that society, I mean, certainly there's trust within these clans and families, right? Or I don't know, you tell me. Is the trust there kind of surviving in a different way?
Part of the problem when the revolution fell apart, Mao died, I mean, as brutal and savage as it was, there was a kind of a basic supposition of how things were, and people did believe in it, in serving the people and selflessness, sacrifice, all this stuff. They were betrayed, and they I think, felt it. And after that, though, when Deng Xiaoping came in and opened things up again economically, what was missing was the value system. Now, communism under Mao had a value system, as brutal as it was. But afterwards, what was the value system? Nobody knew. Was it Confucianism? Was it capitalism? Was it Christianity? Was it Buddhism? Confucianism? All these things had been attacked and largely destroyed. So trust sort of nestles in a value system. And if you don't have a value system that's self-evident, it's hard to know how to kind of teach your kids. And I would say, and there was what they described as a 信任危机, a trust crisis of trust. And that continues in a very pronounced form today. A pronounced lack of trust between people. Doesn't mean you might not have some friends you trust. In the old days, you would have trusted no one. But it means that basically, it's a much more transactional world. And that's why when we began this conversation, and I said that Trump sort of has a certain advantage there because he's a transactional guy. Doesn't take trust, doesn't matter on values, you know, just, do you have what I want? I'll give you something, you give me something. So China has become a very transactional world where trust is in short supply, I would say.
That's fascinating. Now, I know we got to go here, but I want to pull the lens back, since you pulled it back to Trump, but to this two-system moment in the... So we've been focusing on China, rightly so. This is where we want to go. We want to leverage your expertise. But as critical as we've been on China and its future going forward, you know, we shouldn't tar them too much. I mean, we should pull the lens back on the Western side of things. I'm just curious on your own reflection on the two systems, because you could argue there's a very similar thing going on in the West here too. You know, trust is shattered. I mean, it's like things aren't working. And you could just run through almost all those. Certain places have gotten gorged with money, others are struggling, and it's like, where's the common values? I mean, a bunch of stuff. I'm just curious, any thoughts on the world, on the other side of the equation, and how these two systems might go forward a little bit?
I do think the presumption that the Western system had a kind of a teleology that it was inescapably heading towards, that the whole world was on that historical trajectory and would ultimately follow us, is now up for grabs. I mean, I think we grew up with that Enlightenment value, sooner or later, you know, the end of history, remember that, Francis Fukuyama?
Totally.
I mean, we very deeply steeped in that notion, that presumption, perhaps even, you know, the city on the hill, et cetera. I think that has really been called in question, not only by our own sort of the unraveling of our own political system and society and values, but by the putative rise of China and the success of China and this different system. They are tempted to look at us and see us as a failed model. We tend now to look at ourselves more and wonder, where is history headed? Are we on the right side of history, or are they on the right side of history? Now, ultimately this gets down to a very personal question of how you want to live and what kind of values you esteem. But I do think this is what makes this historical moment so confusing, is it is an inflection point when the presumptions that we've had for many, many decades, even centuries, about how things are moving, should move, and that China would ultimately come along, have been thrown into a cocked hat.
Do you have any thoughts on where that might go? I mean, are you hopeful about where this is moving, or do you see the West as revitalizing and kind of
I never would count America down, but I have to say Donald Trump was a shock. And I don't think he is an avatar of the values that I stand for and want to live by and want my kids to live by. And that's what made it so interesting for me to be in China with him, that in many ways, he's very Chinese. And he would survive best and be best in a one-party system. You know, no fake news, no investigations, you know, no civil society, no churches talking about morality, you know, where you can control the narrative. You could be like Xi Jinping. So I think, in a funny way, we are, I mean, we'll see. I mean, I don't know which side is America might be yet be reborn. But I see some very ominous tendencies which make me look at China differently.
More positively or more?
I do always want to look at them from to see and acknowledge what they've accomplished. And I want to look at the system critically to see if it has relevance and virtues. But having said that, I don't want to live in a one-party authoritarian Leninist system myself. Sorry, it's not for me. Now, many businessmen say, "Oh, it's so successful, and you know, and we're in such a mess. Let's just give it a try." Well, Germany tried that. Franco's Spain tried that. Italy under Mussolini tried that. I'd rather not.
I share that thought, and I think what we'll have to do is have another conversation, as we kind of do every 5 years, and we'll see how this plays out in 5 years.
Well,
and,
let's see. I have no idea.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us here. It's been a fascinating conversation, and really,
Yeah.
we live in what's the classic? We live in strange times or interesting times.
Interesting times.
Or is that wasn't that some Chinese thing?
But it turned out it wasn't. It's just what you know, Westerners think the Chinese say.
It really turns out to be.
I don't know what I never heard of the real. I mean, I don't think Confucius ever said it.
Anyhow, thank you so much. It's great.